Hi, I want to welcome you to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I am a recovering alcoholic, Episcopal priest here in Austin, Texas. And we have a website. I would encourage you to go visit that if you haven't done so already. It is called Two Way Prayer. Teaches you the lost 11th step practice that they did back in the Oxford group and in early AA. I've really found that it changes lives dramatically, and I hope you'll get some really positive experiences from that. We're also doing workshops on that subject. Got a couple coming up. You can write me at two way prayer, TWO, two way prayer at gmail.com, and I'll send you a flyer on the next few workshops that we've got scheduled. We're continuing our series now on the life of Bill Wilson, trying to examine it from the inside out, see really what maybe in some depth what was going on inside of his life, his heart, his head. And this is going to be the final episode on Bill's life. And there's actually a lot more. I mean, he's got 35 years. We brought it up in the series to the point where he's met Dr. Bob, and they're getting sober together. Um, there's just so much material written on the Big Book and the origins of the Big Book, and I'd encourage you to go and study that. It's important. But then Bill had another 35 years of sobriety that he experienced, and there's lots and lots going on in his life, and I found myself struggling with this particular episode of the podcast, and I was reminded of an important bit of wisdom that an old priest had passed on to me many years ago when he said when you're preparing to do a sermon, and I would say doing a little podcast episode like this is somewhat similar. It says when you're preparing for that, always ask yourself, do I have something to say, or do I just have to say something? And there's a world of difference between those two. And so often I would find myself in the sermon situation where, God, I got to say something here now. What is it? And those are usually not very good sermons. But when you can get down to, do I have something to say? That makes all the difference, because you're then coming from your own heart, and people know that. And so my interest, has always been in the origins of AA, tracking it back to the Oxford group, what was going on back there, because that's the thing that really helped me to get a different perspective of the 12-step program, where it came from, what was going on under the surface. And I've not been all that interested in the post Big Book time frame. So that's why I had some difficulty with this area. Not a great student of Bill Wilson's life after that part, but I kind of felt to give some completion to this series, we needed to do it. So I'm maybe trying to find some lesser known parts of his life that could be of interest to folks. And again, as I always am trying to do, I hope, is to look at what are some lessons that we can draw from his life, because AA would not be here without Bill Wilson, and he's had a tremendous influence on it. So, three or four things to kind of jump into, and one was Bill's own relationship with religion and spirituality, and it really took some strange turns over the years, and it's something that all of us struggle with. So seeing where he was coming from and where some of the roads that he went down might be of some help. Now, there's a book called Pass It On. It was written in 1984. It's AA conference approved literature. It was written by the Central Office. And it is a life of Bill Wilson. Up to this point, I'd been using Bill Wilson's my first 40 years. And what I liked about that was it was his, we had it straight from him. It was a tape recorded sessions that he did in preparation for a book that was going to be written. And so the quotes were solid. A little harder to get them because it ended abruptly right around the end of our last episode when he meets with Dr. Bob, and that was the end of the firsthand narrative. So Pass It On kind of picks it up from there, and I'm pretty amazed at chapter 16 of the book. I'd point you to reading that, because it goes into some depth, and maybe some greater depth than people are aware of some of the spiritualism that both Bill and Dr. Bob and Lois and Anne were participating in back in the early days, doing seances and Ouija boards and channeling messages from dead spirits. So I wanted to kind of start with that, and let's see. So here's a quote from the Pass It On book. It says this: as early as 1941, Bill and Lois were holding regular Saturday spook sessions at Bedford Hills. That's their home in New York. One of the downstairs bedrooms was dubbed by them the, quote, spook room, unquote. Here they conducted many of their psychic experiments. Of one session with a Ouija board, Bill wrote this description: the Ouija board got moving in earnest. What followed was the fairly usual experience. It was a strange melange of Aristotle, St. Francis, diverse archangels with odd names, deceased friends, some in purgatory and others doing nicely, thank you. There were malign and mischievous ones of all descriptions, telling of vices quite beyond my ken, even as former alcoholics. Then the seemingly virtuous entities would elbow them out with messages of comfort, information, advice, and sometimes just sheer nonsense, unquote. Bill would lie on the couch in the living room, semi-withdrawn, but not in a trance, and receive messages, sometimes a word at a time, sometimes a letter at a time. And B, neighbor and spook circle regular, would write the material on a pad. Lois described one of the more dramatic of these sessions. Bill would lie down on the couch. He would, quote, get these things. He kept doing it every week or so. Each time, certain people would come in. Sometimes it would be new ones, and they'd carry on some story. The chapter goes on. It talks about times when the furniture, the desk they were using would levitate. Stories of visitations that he had up in Nantucket about whalers from 2 centuries before or so, sailors who were dead, and yet he knew their names, and later found them chiseled on a description in a museum. It's strange stuff. It's very strange stuff, and that was one of the directions that Wilson went in. And here's a point I really want to make about Bill, because I'm not here to make fun of him or discredit him with what some of the information we're going to get into. I am here to say this, that Bill Wilson had a spiritual experience that was genuinely real for him. And he spent the rest of his life, the 35 years, trying to see how can spirituality be brought to people, for alcoholics specifically, for whom spirituality and religion are an obstacle, are a block. And I don't know if that's what was promoting this, but that's certainly behind many of the experiences that he gets himself into, and that we're going to look into here. So Bill also tried to become a Catholic. He was drawn to the Catholic religion. There's much about it that he liked. It was certainly influenced by Father Ed Dowling, the Jesuit priest who came to visit him early in his recovery and saw something in Bill that he couldn't see in himself. And so Bill was drawn to that, and he was drawn to studying the faith. He spent time with Bishop Fulton Sheen, pretty famous um, preacher, Catholic preacher from the 50s and 40s is when Bill was seeing him. And he tried to become a Catholic, but he said that there were certain things that obstacles, barriers that he just couldn't bring himself to believe. And so he struggled with his faith. And he also struggled with some other areas that I want to talk about. And these were depression. He was terribly afflicted by depression. And he was also afflicted with infidelities, marital infidelities. Depression ran in his family. His mother suffered from it. She was often absent from the family, going away for extended stays of treatment. And Bill fell into that early in his life. We talked about that in some previous episodes when his girlfriend died. He went into a funk that lasted some years. Bill is being dishonest in his marriage. There's little doubt about this, and so he's questioning, is the depression linked to the infidelities? And he seems to come to the answer that yes, it was. So I want to read a little bit now from who's this? Tom Powers. And Tom Powers was an individual who Bill Wilson sponsored there in New York. He helped Bill write the 12 and 12 and AA Comes of Age and the second edition of the Big Book. Tom was a very talented individual. And Bill was his sponsor. Tom didn't get it the first few times. And Tom struggled with marital infidelities as well. So he was very sensitive to this issue. So what I'm going to quote from is a book by Francis Hartigan. And he was the secretary to Lois Wilson, her executive secretary. And he's visiting here with Tom Powers and interviewing him. And here's what Francis writes. He says, Tom said he would frequently tell Bill, you need to change your behavior. According to Tom, trying to write about the need for alcoholics to practice rigorous honesty, take searching and fearless moral inventories, admit faults, make amends to those they had harmed, and become ready to have God remove character defects, left Bill feeling terribly fraudulent. The result was those days others have described when he was so despondent he literally could not pick his head up from the desk. Quote, all the while we were working on the 12 and 12, Tom said. I would argue with him about this. Bill, I told him, you're killing yourself, and think about what you're doing to Lois. While other people I spoke with insisted that Lois never knew about Bill's affairs, Tom insisted that, quote, Lois knew everything, and she didn't have to guess about it either. A lot of people tried to protect her, but there were others who would run to Stepping Stones, their home, to tell Lois all about it whenever they saw Bill with another woman. I asked Tom how Bill reacted when Tom would insist that Bill's guilt over his infidelities was responsible for his depressions. I think that was the worst part of it, he said. Bill would always agree with me. I know, he'd say, you're right. Then, just when I would think we were finally getting somewhere, he would say, but I can't give it up. When I would press him as to why the hell not, he would start rationalizing. What would really kill me is when he'd say, well, Lois has always been more like a mother to me, which somehow was supposed to make it all right for him to cheat on her. Well, uh, so there's the situation that is going on inside of Bill, and Bill has always been conflicted. I mean, if you were here for the earlier episode, you could see that in his life. These unconscious forces that are just pounding away at him. So he finally goes and he gets some professional help. He sees Harry Tiebout, who was probably the first psychiatrist to become really interested in Alcoholics Anonymous, trying to discover why it worked when all the therapy he had done with people was ineffective. And Harry came up with the conclusion that in many ways alcoholics we are by and large immature, really at depth immature. And Wilson would see that in himself, but the growing up didn't really happen, at least not initially. He later changes therapists, and he goes and he sees a woman by the name of Frances Weeks, and she's a Jungian therapist. And so her approach with him was different. It was more in depth. It was not to blame. It was to go inside and to see the conflicts that were going on inside, the shadow parts. That's why one of the reasons I'm particularly interested in shadow work and how that affects us in recovery. Here's a quote from Wilson. He says, while it's highly satisfactory to live one's life for others, it cannot be anything but disastrous to live one's life for others as those others think it should be lived. The extent to which the AA movement and the individuals in it determine my choices is really astonishing. Things which are primary to me are unfulfilled. So we have the person of Mr. Anonymous in conflict with Bill Wilson. And there he lays it out, that the forces underlying the depression are really unconscious forces that are beating him up internally. And I've worked with alcoholics and addicts for 40 some odd years, getting close to 48, and we are liars. That is why the honesty part is so important. We are split inside. We have the persona that is our mask, that we are outward image to the world, and we've got these shadow parts that are just eating away at us. And so Jung's a major piece of Jung's work was to make the unconscious conscious, so that we can face it and integrate it into our lives, integrate the conflicts, or overcome them through integration, basically. Let's say, hey. So there's an important part of Bill's life, his struggles, but another part is that Bill was always a seeker. How to help alcoholics that find a relationship with God elusive, and this was another whole part of his life that's not talked about very much, and yet it's really important. So he did experiments with LSD, and these are talked about in AA. In Pass It On. But there's also a really good book. Its author is Don Lattin, Lattin. It's titled Distilled Spirits. And in it, he gets really deep into the weeds with, well, so to speak, that is, about the LSD, where Wilson is in relationship with Aldous Huxley, the famous author, and Gerald Heard, a man from Ireland, and Wilson, and they're experimenting with LSD, as did Lois, as did several other of the individuals that Wilson was close to. And in Pass It On, uh, Wilson says this, that it helped eliminate many barriers erected by the self or ego that stand in the way of one's direct experiences of the cosmos and of God. Uh, Wilson thought he might have found something that could make a big difference in the lives of many who still suffered. So there are some areas that are probably not terribly well known, and yet they're important in terms of understanding some of the conflicts uh, that were going on inside Bill Wilson's. So what do we learn? What is it that we can take away from this? Three or four things that come to my mind. One is that not drinking is not the end solution. It's the start of the solution. I'm not going to get very far in my recovery work, real recovery work, if the drinking and the drugging are still going on. And Jung said there are no shortcuts. LSD may open doors inside and show us other worlds, but they're not going to last. And you can't short circuit the process. You can't cheat your way into a relationship with God. Um, I think the message here is we can't live divided lives. Secrets keep us sick. Um, Again, I've worked with many thousands of alcoholics and addicts over the years, and the relief that they have found almost always comes through the revelation of the secrets. I mean, our fourth step, our 10th steps, these are so important, and pay attention to them. They are admitting to self what's going on beneath the surface. They are admitting to God what's going on beneath the surface, and admitting it to one other human being. I've got to find relief from this. I've got to be able to talk with someone about what it is like to live with me. Um, Third thing I take away is to seek wholeness rather than holiness. Integration is really where it's at. To own our shadow parts, to make them conscious, and perhaps another point to take away is don't be afraid to get help along the way. That we're living in a spiritual kindergarten is the phrase that Wilson used, and it's a lovely phrase. And AA is a spiritual kindergarten. It's where we come in, and the door must be wide open, and that is one of the great um, legacies of Wilson and the people who wrote and edited the Big Book. We want this thing to be wide open. Oxford Group was quite a bit more closed. Um, Keep it open. The description I use is it's like a funnel, and the mouth of the funnel should be really, really wide so that it can catch everything that's pouring in. But then, as time goes on, the funnel has to narrow. It has to get tighter. And if this doesn't happen, what happens is, like with Bill, other addictions come in and start ruling my inner world. He was a womanizer. He was a chronic smoker and would not or could not quit. And so the illness shifts. If it can't get me this way, it will get me that way. As long as it is in control. And that's why we say this thing is an ism. It's not just alcohol, it's alcoholism. It's self manifesting itself in ways that are destructive. And that's why the spiritual solution is the only one, at least for chronics like myself. So we have a founder who was flawed, and there you go. He's flawed. There's no question about that. And I say thank God for that. I mean, one of the reasons a lot of this stuff is not so well known, and sometimes I remember I was talking to a little group some years back, and I mentioned Wilson's infidelities, and someone came up and, please don't say that. Don't say that. You're going to chase somebody away. Well, we have a tendency to project onto our leaders qualities that they don't have. And that's unhealthy, and it's immature. And I think Wilson got caught. He also did a lot of research and work and published 3 papers on the effects of niacin, vitamin B3, on the alcoholic, and how that might really help with the depression and open oneself up to be receptive to the spiritual solution. I know when I came into the program first time in 1970, a lot of people were taking niacin, and their faces would flush red, and Wilson actually said what he wanted to be remembered for was not being the co-founder of AA, but for the work that he had done with niacin. So I don't think that, one important phrase that we have is AA does not have a monopoly on recovery. And if you really study the history intelligently, we never did, we never claimed to. If other things can be helpful, for God's sakes, use them. But let AA be the path to spiritual connection, that at the heart, that really is the illness, that at the heart of transformation comes this new connection with what? With something. And that something is love. That something is love. That's why the 4 absolutes to me are so important. And the 4th one of those is love. And Wilson wrote maybe we'll do an episode on this sometime. He wrote a paper on for the Grapevine called emotional sobriety, the next stage, and that's what he focused in on. That finding that love is really what is going to be the thing that replaces the alcohol, the drugs, the dependencies also that he clung to, other than God. So let's end this series with Bill in one of his famous declarations, and it's in honor of him, and it's, I am responsible. He says, I am responsible when anyone, anywhere reaches out for help. I want the hand of AA always to be there, and for that, I am responsible. And I don't think we need to be afraid of the truth either. I think Bill would like that. We've tried making him into a god, and it ain't helpful. So thanks for listening. Hope it was helpful. God bless. Keep coming back.